Welcome back to Midnight Confessions, where the darkest secrets emerge when the world sleeps. Tonight's tale comes from a soul forever bound by supernatural forces, a story of 4 children who touched a crimson thread and awakened something ancient and hungry. What began as innocent playground friendship became a 13-year countdown to damnation itself. Story. Perhaps my descent into this living nightmare began the moment I cursed my former lover on her wedding day, calling her the vilest name as she walked down that aisle in white. Now, 2 months later, on this suffocating July evening, I can feel something malevolent watching me from the shadows. I never believed in supernatural curses or demonic interventions, but as a naive child, I was convinced I had discovered something far more terrifying than any soulmate. I had found my eternal damnation. The word soulmate first crawled into my consciousness when I was 10. Sneaking through my older brother Jason's laptop like a digital grave robber. His girlfriend had shattered his heart, leaving behind only desperate Google searches. Have I lost my soulmate forever? The search results led him to disturbing forums about red threads of destiny, occult binding rituals, and warnings about supernatural connections that could never be severed. Spoiler alert, those cryptic posts were prophetic. Jason and his girl are now trapped in matrimonial bliss with screaming children. A different kind of horror story. But this nightmare isn't about Jason's cursed love life. This is about my friends, if you can call them that after what we unleashed. The day everything went to hell was when Dexter McIntyre approached me in 4th grade, his eyes wild with an unnatural gleam. In his trembling hand was a crimson thread that seemed to pulse with its own malevolent life. The color was too deep, too red, like dried blood under moonlight. "Your mother gave me this," he whispered, his voice carrying an otherworldly echo that made my skin crawl. I should have run. I should have screamed. Instead, I found myself mesmerized, slipping my finger into what I now realize was not just a knot, but a binding circle, an ancient trap designed to ensnare souls. Zach Chatham and Phelan Clark joined our cursed ritual, their eyes glazed over as if under some supernatural compulsion. We thought it was innocent child's play until the thread began to tighten like a living serpent. Cutting into our flesh with impossible strength, Phelan, that tiny blonde banshee, began shrieking, not from pain, but as if something demonic was clawing its way out of her throat. Her golden ponytail whipped around her face like tendrils of possessed hair, and her usually bright eyes had turned completely black. Zach's freckled face contorted into something inhuman as he laughed, a sound that belonged in the depths of hell rather than an elementary classroom. His giggles echoed through the halls like the cackles of a demented spirit, growing deeper and more sinister with each passing second. The thread seemed to feed on our terror, growing stronger as we struggled. When Zach yanked his finger, the supernatural binding sent jolts of agony through all 4 of us, as if we were connected not just by string, but by our very life forces. "It burns." Phelan's voice had changed, becoming guttural and ancient. She shoved Zach with inhuman strength, sending him flying across the room, yet we remained bound by that accursed crimson thread. In the nurse's sterile office, under those harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look corpse pale, we huddled together like sacrificial offerings. Zach's freckles had turned dark as blood spots, and his whispered question carried the weight of prophecy. "Are we going to die?" When Nurse Kale approached with her scissors, they gleamed like ritual blades. The metal seemed to recoil from the thread as if it were touching something unholy. Even she couldn't hide her terror as she examined our binding. "How is this possible?" she gasped, her professional composure cracking. "This makes no sense. It's just one thread, but it's stronger than steel cable." The thread pulsed under her touch, and I swear I heard it whisper in a language that predated human civilization. Zach tried to blame Dexter, but his accusations came out as demonic growls that made the air in the room grow thick and oppressive. "You started this ritual, didn't you?" Zach's voice was no longer his own. "You summoned something, didn't you, Bird?" Dexter, or the thing wearing Dexter's face, just stared with those hollow, knowing eyes. When he finally spoke, his words seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. "Some things can't be undone." The nurse's final cut released more than just physical binding. It unleashed something that had been waiting, hungry, patient. As the thread fell to the sterile floor, it didn't lie still like normal string. It writhed like a dying snake, leaving tiny droplets of what looked suspiciously like blood on the white tiles. We sat in stunned silence until that inhuman laughter started again. First Zach, then the others, but their voices had changed. The sound echoed in frequencies that human ears weren't meant to process. and I realized with growing horror that we weren't laughing. Something else was laughing through us. I grabbed the severed thread, and the moment my skin touched it, visions of unspeakable horrors flooded my mind. I saw Dexter's true nature, his connection to something ancient and evil. When I dangled it before his face, his grin revealed teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "I'll dispose of it properly," he said, but I watched him slip our cursed binding into his pocket like a treasured relic. That's when I knew. Dexter McIntyre wasn't just the victim of neglect. He was the architect of our damnation. Everyone called him Bird because of his wild, nest-like hair. But I began to suspect that nickname had deeper, more sinister origins. His family situation was the perfect cover story. An absent mother, an alcoholic father, poverty and neglect that made everyone pity rather than suspect him. Dexter arrived at school like a specter, wearing clothes that reeked of something far worse than urine. They carried the stench of sulfur and decay. His hair wasn't just unkempt. It seemed to move on its own, as if tiny invisible creatures were nesting within the dark strands. The other parents' instinctive fear wasn't about lice or hygiene. It was their primal recognition of something fundamentally wrong with that child. When they pulled their children away, they were obeying an ancient survival instinct that screamed, danger. My mother had warned me to stay away, but after our binding ritual, it was already too late. The thread had connected us in ways that defied human understanding, and Dexter began to reveal his true nature slowly, methodically, like a spider revealing its web. Winter brought fresh horrors. Dexter would appear in sub-zero temperatures wearing nothing but thin clothes, yet his skin never showed signs of frostbite. His feet, visible through those deliberately torn shoes, weren't red from cold. They were red with something else entirely. But the most disturbing thing was his smile. No matter how dire his circumstances appeared, Dexter never stopped smiling. It wasn't the resilient grin of a hopeful child. It was the satisfied smirk of a predator who knew exactly how his hunt would end. After the thread incident, we were drawn to him like moths to a flame that would ultimately consume us. The boy we thought we were befriending wasn't Dexter McIntyre at all. He was something wearing Dexter's face, playing a long game that stretched back generations. My first visit to his house shattered every assumption I'd made about his poverty. The massive marble hallway gleamed like the interior of a mausoleum, and that chandelier cast shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. The suited man who took my coat had eyes that reflected light like a nocturnal predator's. But it was the house itself that revealed the truth. 4 bathrooms, each one containing mirrors that showed reflections that lagged just a split second behind reality. 2 kitchens, one for normal food, and another filled with ingredients that belonged in no earthly cookbook. The maid who kissed Dexter's forehead whispered in his ear using words from no human language. And when she ruffled his hair, I glimpsed something underneath. Not scalp, but what looked like tiny holes, as if something had burrowed through his skull and made a nest inside. Those white baggies Dexter hastily hid weren't drugs. They contained a fine powder that glowed faintly in the dim light and moved as if it were alive. When he claimed it was candy, his reflection in the refrigerator door was grinning, while his physical face remained neutral. His bedroom was a shrine to his missing mother, but the clothes with tags still attached told a different story. These weren't gifts from a loving parent. They were offerings, tributes left by something that wanted to keep him comfortable while he completed his assigned task. "I'm not allowed to wear anything my mother bought me," he explained, but I noticed he said mother, not mom. The distinction felt important, ritualistic, like he was referring to something that had given birth to him but was definitely not human. When Dexter's father stumbled home that evening, drunk and belligerent, I finally understood the family dynamic. The man wasn't Dexter's father. He was his guardian, his handler, someone who'd been assigned to maintain the illusion of a normal, troubled household while something far more sinister grew to maturity in plain sight. The bad word, he called us, wasn't profanity. It was a warning, spoken in the same ancient language I'd heard the thread whisper. He crashed on the couch not from alcohol, but from the supernatural exhaustion of maintaining proximity to whatever Dexter really was. When I told my mother about visiting Dexter's house, her reaction was telling. She didn't scold me for associating with him. Instead, she wrote that dinner invitation with trembling hands, as if compelled by forces beyond her understanding. The note wasn't charity, it was reconnaissance. My mother had recognized something in Dexter that required investigation, and she was using me as bait to get closer to the truth. When Dexter read her invitation, his tears weren't from gratitude. They were from rage at being discovered. But he came anyway because the ritual was incomplete, and he needed us bound to him permanently before he could proceed to the next phase. Sitting in our kitchen while my mother cut his hair was like watching a demon submit to grooming. She wasn't just washing away dirt. She was cleansing him of protective wards and barriers that had been keeping his true nature contained. The new clothes she bought weren't kindness. They were a uniform, preparing him for what was coming next. And I realized with dawning horror that I hadn't saved Dexter McIntyre from neglect. I had invited pure evil into my home, given it a place at my family's table, and allowed it to sink its claws deep into the foundation of everything I held dear. The crush I thought I was developing wasn't love. It was the supernatural compulsion of prey, recognizing its predator, the Stockholm syndrome of the damned acknowledging their destroyer. And somewhere in the depths of my soul, I could feel that crimson thread still binding us together, pulsing with malevolent life, counting down the days until our final reckoning would begin. I buried my growing obsession deep within my chest, but the supernatural forces at work had other plans. When Dexter and Phelan shared what looked like an innocent moment at the summer carnival, I felt something dark and jealous claw its way up from the depths of my soul. Zach and I discovered their cursed connection a month later when we caught them in an unnatural embrace, their hands intertwined in a way that made the air around them shimmer with otherworldly energy. When we confronted them, both turned pale as corpses, their eyes reflecting an inner fire that belonged to neither of them. "We're not connected," Dexter snarled, but his voice carried multiple tones, as if something else was speaking through him. "She's too weak to handle what's coming." But I saw the truth in their supernatural bond. The way Phelan's tears fell upward instead of down, defying gravity itself. Her choked agreement felt like a death rattle. Yes, Dexter is contaminated. After his transformation through my mother's grooming ritual, other girls in our class had begun calling him attractive, but I noticed their compliments came with glazed expressions and voices that sounded eerily similar, as if the same entity was speaking through multiple mouths. Dexter had begun to believe he was some kind of chosen vessel, strutting around with the confidence of something that had never been fully human. Meanwhile, Phelan was slowly being consumed from within. At 12 years old, their connection intensified into something that transcended normal childhood affection. In the park, when Dexter rested his head on Phelan's shoulder, I watched black veins spread beneath her skin wherever he touched. Their relationship was actually a feeding process. He was slowly draining her life force. They would break up over trivial matters, but I realized these weren't normal relationship spats. These were moments when Phelan's human consciousness briefly fought back against whatever was possessing her. The reconciliations were simply the entity regaining control. The way Dexter looked at her wasn't love. It was hunger. His smile revealed teeth that had grown sharper, more numerous, and Phelan's glow wasn't happiness. It was her life essence being slowly harvested. My physical symptoms weren't a crush. They were my body's rejection of the supernatural, poison that was spreading through our group. The fever, the nausea, the inexplicable rage. These were signs that whatever had claimed Dexter was trying to claim me too. I began to hate not myself, but the foreign presence that was invading my thoughts, trying to turn natural feelings into something twisted and unnatural. The butterflies I felt for Phelan weren't innocent attraction. They were larvae of something demonic trying to hatch inside my chest. Our childhood friendship was ending not because we were growing up, but because we were being systematically consumed by forces beyond our comprehension. When my father announced our move to New York just after my 13th birthday, I felt a brief moment of relief, as if the supernatural binding might weaken with distance. Mom's 2-week notice felt less like a moving timeline and more like a countdown to some terrible deadline. The way she delivered the news, with trembling hands and eyes that wouldn't meet mine, suggested she knew more about our situation than she was revealing. As we prepared for high school, I noticed disturbing changes in my friends. Zach had grown unnaturally tall overnight, his new height accompanied by new friends whose names he couldn't remember, and whose faces seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. Directly at them, Phelan and Dexter's official relationship had evolved into something that defied natural law. When they stood together, shadows bent toward them, and small animals would flee the area as if sensing an approaching predator. But the most horrifying development was Phelan's private meetings with me. That stupid kiss at the slumber party hadn't been a moment of confused adolescence. It had been a transfer of whatever was consuming her. When she claimed she kind of liked it, her voice carried the same otherworldly echo that had infected Dexter's speech. Our bike rides to the lake became pilgrimages to a place that was slowly transforming into something unholy. The water had taken on an oily quality that reflected images that weren't there. Instead of playing childhood games, we were drawn to the water's edge like worshippers. Approaching a dark altar, Phelan's sunbathing wasn't about getting a tan. She was absorbing something from the solar radiation that turned her skin an unnatural golden hue. Dexter's reading material wasn't normal books. The pages were filled with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and the words seemed to move when no one was watching. Even Zach's jokes had become darker. His creepy stories containing details about local disappearances and unexplained phenomena that no child should have known. His laughter no longer sounded human. The awkwardness we felt wasn't typical teenage discomfort. It was our human souls recognizing that we were no longer entirely human. The air itself had become thick with malevolent energy, and my gut instincts were screaming warnings that my rational mind tried to dismiss. When I finally revealed my family's departure, something shifted in the supernatural atmosphere around us. Our emotional goodbye over ice cream was interrupted by Zach producing his father's wine. But the bottle was ancient, covered in dust and symbols that predated any known civilization. As we drank, I realized we weren't getting tipsy. We were being prepared for something. The wine tasted of copper and ash, and I watched my friends' eyes turn completely black as they consumed it. These weren't my first real friends. They were my first supernatural captors, entities that had been masquerading as childhood companions while slowly ensnaring my soul in their web of dark magic. The night before my departure, Dexter didn't simply enter my house. He materialized in my bedroom at exactly 6 a.m., appearing like a specter without disturbing doors or windows. When I tried to protest, his hand over my mouth burned like ice. My mother's participation wasn't maternal concern. She was a knowing participant in whatever ritual was about to unfold. Her packed picnic basket contained items that belonged in no earthly kitchen, and her instruction to bring her back by curfew carried the weight of a supernatural contract. Our day at the lake was a preparation ceremony disguised as a farewell party. The perfect summer weather wasn't natural. The very elements were being manipulated to create ideal conditions for what was to come. As darkness fell, I began to see my companion's true forms in the flickering campfire light. Zach's usual humor had disappeared entirely, replaced by an intensity that made his eyes reflect like those of a nocturnal predator. His gaze wasn't on the stars. He was communicating with something in the void between them. Phelan's hair didn't whip in natural wind. It moved with its own supernatural current, and her forced laughter couldn't hide the fact that she was no longer entirely herself. Every time our eyes met, I saw her human consciousness trapped behind layers of otherworldly possession. When Dexter produced that crimson thread, the same one that had bound us years earlier, I realized this entire friendship had been orchestrated around this moment. His smile by the firelight revealed not affection, but satisfaction at a plan finally reaching fruition. "We need to ensure our connection lasts forever," he said. But his voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple entities speaking in unison, no matter what happens to us. The thread wasn't preserved out of sentimentality. It had been growing stronger, feeding off our shared experiences and preparing for this final binding ritual. The book Dexter produced wasn't from any library or bookstore. Its pages were made from materials that looked disturbingly organic, and the words weren't printed. They were carved into the surface and filled with a substance that glowed faintly in the darkness. As midnight approached, we weren't simply reminiscing about childhood. We were completing the final preparations for a ritual that would bind our souls across dimensions and through death itself. The bioluminescent plankton in the water weren't natural organisms. They were supernatural markers, indicators that we had chosen the perfect location for our dark ceremony. When the boys dipped their feet in the water, the creatures swarmed toward them like iron filings drawn to a magnet. My private goodbye to Phelan in the freezing water was actually the transfer of the final component needed for the ritual. When she promised to wait for me, she wasn't speaking as herself. The entity possessing her was making a vow that transcended human understanding. Her promise wasn't about friendship or love. It was a supernatural contract that would ensure our souls remained connected regardless of physical distance or even death. The cold water around our ankles began to boil as she spoke, and I felt something permanent and irreversible take hold in my chest. When Dexter interrupted us, he wasn't being playfully intrusive. He was ensuring the ritual proceeded according to the ancient requirements detailed in his unholy book. At the stroke of midnight, under a moon that seemed closer and more malevolent than any I'd seen before, we recreated our childhood binding. But this time, the red thread had evolved into something far more powerful and sinister. The passage Dexter read wasn't English. It was a summoning incantation in a language that predated human civilization. As he spoke, I felt our individual consciousness begin to merge and blur, creating a collective entity that was greater and more terrible than the sum of our parts. Physical pain wasn't discomfort. It was our human souls being forcibly rewired to accommodate otherworldly connections that violated natural law. When I tried to break free, I discovered that my body was no longer entirely under my own control. The moon's glow didn't illuminate my friend's eyes. It possessed them, turning them into conduits for something ancient and hungry that had been waiting centuries for the perfect vessels. The binding we created wasn't friendship, it was a supernatural contract that condemned us to eternal connection, ensuring that we would find each other again and again across lifetimes, dimensions, and realities until some darker purpose was finally fulfilled. When Dexter severed the thread and dropped it into the fire, the flames turned black and burned without heat. The thread didn't destroy, it transformed, releasing our binding into the ethereal realm where it would follow us forever. Zach's discomfort wasn't normal unease. He was the first to fully comprehend what we had done to ourselves. His small, frightened voice carried the weight of someone who had glimpsed their own damnation. My mother's arrival wasn't coincidental timing. She was part of the supernatural network that had orchestrated this entire sequence of events. Her dragging me away wasn't protective. It was ensuring I couldn't break the ritual before it had fully taken hold. 13 years later, the supernatural forces that had been dormant finally awakened with devastating consequences. Phelan's forgotten wedding invitation wasn't an oversight. It was a deliberate exclusion designed to trigger the next phase of our cursed binding. Mother's funeral brought me back into the supernatural network, and my accidental discovery of Phelan's flower shop account was actually the result of algorithmic manipulation by forces beyond human understanding. When we reconnected, the old feelings that returned weren't nostalgia. They were the reactivation of supernatural compulsions that had been lying dormant in my consciousness for over a decade. Phelan looked unchanged, not because she had aged well, but because whatever possessed her had been preserving her physical form for this reunion. Her overly long dresses and flowers weren't fashion choices. They were ritual garments designed to channel otherworldly energies. The pull I felt when seeing her wasn't attraction. It was our cursed souls, recognizing their binding and responding with supernatural magnetism that defied physical laws. My emotional breakdown about my mother's death became a feeding opportunity for the entities that controlled us. Phelan's comfort wasn't human. Empathy, it was a harvesting of my grief and trauma to strengthen our supernatural connection. Her revelation about catching Dexter and Zach together wasn't discovery of betrayal. It was witnessing the next stage of their possession, as the entities controlling them began to blur the boundaries between individual identities. The wrongness Phelan described when they were apart wasn't missing me. It was the supernatural binding punishing them for incomplete connectivity. Their attempts to make it work as a trio had been doomed because I was the missing component in a four-part supernatural equation. The physical symptoms she described weren't heartache. They were withdrawal symptoms from a supernatural addiction that had been engineered to make separation impossible. Zach's collapse and revival wasn't medical emergency. It was his human consciousness briefly, dying and being replaced by something else. Dexter's blood clots weren't illness. They were his human blood being systematically replaced with something inhuman. Phelan's cardiac arrest wasn't heart failure. It was her human heart physically rejecting the otherworldly energy that was trying to claim her completely. When she smiled while describing our shared heartache, I realized that whatever was speaking through her was savoring the approaching culmination of a plan that had been decades in the making. Her dark eyes in the club's twinkling light weren't reflecting the decor. They were windows into an abyss that had been growing inside her since childhood, waiting for the moment when all four of us would be reunited to complete whatever terrible purpose we had been cultivated to serve. The realization hit me like a physical blow. We weren't friends who had been cursed. We were supernatural entities who had been masquerading as human children, slowly awakening to our true nature as we reached the age when our dark purpose could finally be fulfilled. And now, with all four components finally back together, something ancient and terrible was about to be unleashed upon the world, with us as its willing, possessed servants. Or is it? Subscribe now to discover what happens when supernatural binding collides with adult reality. and whether any trace of humanity can survive when ancient evil finally claims its chosen vessels.